Aloha. Welcome to Cooper Union with what's happened around the world with human rights. It's an honor to be with you here on this historic day of the eve of the adoption of the Universal Periodic Review of the United States third cycle. Today, I'm very fortunate to be with Dr. Vickie Casanova-Willis, the new co-executive director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, and we'll be speaking with you today about why the Universal Periodic Review is important and what we can do together to make sure that the recommendations that will be either accepted or rejected tomorrow will provide a roadmap for how we can promote and protect human rights in the United States. Vickie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. And I know we've known each other for a decade, and I know you've spent a lifetime really dedicated to liberation movement and human rights for all people in our country. And while we're looking at the US accepting the UN UPR adoption and a future of freedom for all, we know we've been looking at these issues through other UN human rights treaty bodies, and you've always been connected on the ground, but always been able to put the pressure of the global institutions on the US as well. Could you share with us a little bit about what you're able to do in Chicago to create a culture of human rights?
Absolutely. You know, many years ago, the issues that were surfacing in Chicago really reflected what many more people in the world today now are able to see with the advent of, just so much media coverage with regard to really egregious overreach, often by police, but really it's the whole law enforcement system. So the Chicago case study, if you will, had to do with one such instance where it was quite literally torture of the sort that people experience at, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay and so forth. And I happen to be married to a very courageous activist who also is a lawyer, retired now, but, after exhausting all of the methods and the tools in the courts, in the streets, people marching, appealing to Amnesty International, looking at every single possible way to hold these rogue police accountable for literally torturing over 200 young men. They were teenagers. So we say men if they're 17 or so, but they were children. Heinous torture, electric shock, often to the genitals. I mean, literally, you name it. The type of thing that people spiritually and mentally have a hard time surviving, even if physically their bodies survive. And then many times this was a tactic that would convince them to confess to a crime, often that they did not commit. Then they'd be incarcerated for 20 years, most of their viable youth and into their middle ages in many cases. And there was simply no recourse. These were people who were considered below the law and not worth saving. And the people of the community, as well as attorneys and educators, said there must be a better way. We looked to what Brother Malcolm X, Paul Robeson, our elders at NAACP back in the 40s and 50s did when they said we charge genocide. Then it was the more typical lynching that you think of with, nooses and people being murdered, having their lives taken in that way. But within a short time frame, we learned through Attorney Stan Willis about the International Human Rights Framework and found that we could indeed go to something like that's called the Organization of American States, or OAS, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. Because that was in DC, and we went right up to DC instead of having to get on a plane and go to Geneva. We learned there that, contrary to what some people will say, and then I'll pause here, contrary to what some people think, that human rights or international human rights is way over across the pond somewhere in Geneva and has no applicability here, that is not true. We found that their opinions, their recommendations that came forth from those commissioners who were there hearing our case had significant input. And they also put us in touch with people called rapporteurs and working groups and all these many formations for people to bring a measure of justice to bear on our struggles here at home. So with that, within a matter of 4 years, after decades and decades of not being able to hold these torturing police accountable in Chicago. In a matter of 4 years, progressive action, you got to claim your human rights. You can't just name them and claim them. You have to literally enforce them, demand that justice be served. We finally were able to bring about a measure of justice and redress after the typical civil rights and legal framework didn't work. So many true believers that, we have to work for it. It's struggle. It didn't happen overnight, but it absolutely, you can bring human rights home. And that's why the Universal Periodic Review that you have done such a tremendous job in educating people about and helping lead, action on. That's why that's so important with what's about to happen in the morning.
It is exciting because the UPR does bring all the treaty bodies, all the mechanisms together, and it's a good chance for everybody to know what is available. Because the truth is, normally people are just operating in silos or those cylinders of excellence, but the UPR really does unite people for rights. It's anything in the UN Charter, anything that the US has ratified, and we've only ratified 3 of the 9, but at least those on racial discrimination, on civil and political rights, and against torture, we can access those. And then you did share a lot really about those special procedures of the Human Rights Council, the independent experts, the working groups, and the special rapporteurs. And then, of course, anything that a UN agency says about the US can also be cited, and even humanitarian law. So the UPR allows us to reach into all those tools and then to chisel a path for justice. And I think what you shared as well, talking about the regional mechanisms, it's those mechanisms exist, and it's just actually adding that as another avenue to build on really the direct action with some diplomacy to then get the results that you're aiming for. I think also when you describe that example of what happened by going and raising those issues in Geneva, you also hosted Frantz Fanon's daughter when the working group on African descent came to visit. Can you share a little bit about interacting with the special procedures and how those have been helpful?
Absolutely. So, as I shared, well, maybe I didn't articulate it, but I want to do really explicitly. My role with the U.S. Human Rights Network is such a pleasure. I've been an active member of the network for about 17 years now, or almost 17 years, the whole of the time of its existence. So the things that I described were literally with the support and the information and the education of fellow members of the U.S. Human Rights Network. And the coordinating center, is where we call the staff that supports the work of the people. So the important piece is that we did learn about all these different special, provisions and mechanisms. And so a few years ago, 2016, we were notified by the U.S. Human Rights Network that we had the opportunity for the first ever visit to the U.S., is my understanding, from the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. These are independent experts who've devoted their whole lives to learning about, advocating for, working around, issues that affect specifically people of African descent worldwide. So a couple of things happened. We were immediately started organizing in 5 different cities where they were going to come and visit. Their visit entails them hearing from of course, the local and state officials and the powers that be, the policymakers, the legislators, which is important. But then to get the other side of the story, the back story, I call it, and it's very often as a Black story. If you look at it in this country, so much is built on the backs of African descendants, of people of color. And so we wanted to organize these U.S. Human Rights Network members in various cities to make sure that from Baltimore to Chicago to DC to Jackson, Mississippi, that we were, and back to New York, that we were using their time and our time as best we could. And we solidified a message that said, okay, it's led by Mireille Frantz Fanon's daughter, right? Great pedigree, but also a great advocate and activist in her own right, and a whole team of people also. We wanted to make sure that they could hear as many different perspectives from directly impacted people. So it wasn't Vickie or someone else standing in front of a microphone talking for 30 minutes. importantly. We in Chicago decided to take a Chicago Midwest approach. So we opened that door and had at one of our events with them, which we only had 2 opportunities to meet with them, we had over 1,000 people at the Chicago State University campus. It's a predominantly Black institution and very disciplined planning for a couple of months to inform people that you got 2 minutes, right? That elevator speech concept,
Yeah.
right? So be very clear in the human rights framework. Part of what this helps us do as well is to be extremely focused and clear and disciplined about what exactly are our issues, key, right? What are some statistics, prior reports from various bodies, as you mentioned, that we can point to that, hey, these recommendations were made 5 years ago under the CERD to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination, or the CAT to eliminate, against torture, or maybe the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the US has not ratified. But if that's a standard in other countries, we don't feel like we need to be constrained. We can share that. And so the audience was 2 minutes for each person. They came to the mic, they spoke about the water in Flint. Many of the, Lord, think about the Midwest. That summer we had Tamir Rice's family from Ohio. We had Michael Brown's family from, Ferguson, right outside St. Louis. We had so many from Chicago, including those who are still incarcerated after proving that they were tortured into, these crimes. But it was an education process for the working group. That's why they were there. We ended every single testimony with, and reparations are due, right? So that the thread that runs through it is we know human rights are interconnected. And so are our demands.
No, and that was such a powerful aspect. I remember the press conference that they held in Washington, D.C., and I was there just for one other event, and I was able to witness that. And you could see how they were transformed by meeting with the directly impacted peoples and hearing their stories.
Yeah.
They then understood the legal documents that they're trying to uphold. And so really bringing directly impacted people is really the core of what we've been doing with U.S. Human Rights Network. Even in the UPR process, when we began this, it was to get everyone together so that people could come forward in the preparation phase and identify the issues that they care about, come up with the specific articles that are being violated, but most importantly, pose those questions to the United States and make really specific, smart, measurable recommendations so the US couldn't get away from that. And we can see that's where we're coming up to tomorrow. Tomorrow will be the conclusion in a way of a lot of the global advocacy, because the US will be there for roughly an hour to defend its position, to hear from other countries making comments, but also to hear from civil society saying this is what matters most. So we're including that part, but bringing it home. And that reminded me of a lot of the work. One that hashtag for tomorrow is accept my recommendation. And the other one is sort of my city, my rights. And I know really when you look at what you've been doing in Chicago and the activities, it's really been revolutionary in some ways with the agreements with the people of looking at education, looking at reparations, looking at how you can actualize the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the city level. So the other hashtag is like my city, my rights. And maybe you could share a bit about that.
I love that.
And building as well. The last time I think we were in person was at the UPR Cities event in Atlanta. And maybe you could share how that was a space that we were able to see this global movement of human rights cities sort of covering the gap between the federal level and the people, and how human rights cities is a strong movement in our country and around the world.
Absolutely. It really is. That's one of the key benefits of the network. And, in this organizing work, it's certainly not that we get overnight results. If so, after almost 20 years of working, the first UPR, I was able to contribute to that. That was 10, 11 years ago. So it's not like this, it's every 4 years, right? It's not like a tremendous amount of progress happens overnight. But, to mention what you talked about, one of the things that many people in cities are doing is recognizing that in a real sense, this is the level on which violations occur, right? And not to say that we don't have some of the same structural problems, because we certainly do. The environmental racism is a problem. We're working with people with regard to the UPR, one of the UPR cities, wonderful forums that was a side session that you helped, organize for last week, that dealt with people in the Gulf South, right, with regard to how literally not only the earth but the people are dying in Cancer Alley because our government and many of the multinational corporations around the globe put profits before people. And it's costing all of us. So the city's approach is that we now are learning more and continuing to teach about these international human rights standards, right? In part, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, little bitty book that lists 30 articles, they call them. I know, I was like, I can't reach mine over there. There you go. I love it. And it makes very clear that civil rights is a small piece of the pie. What we're really entitled to is human rights, and that includes economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights, environmental rights, sexual rights, reproductive justice, all of this. And so when people start to realize, I knew it, right? Yeah. Now, and okay, here are these tools to be able to report, have governments report back, have governments talk government to government. In this case, it can be municipality to municipality. It can be, for example, Chicago. A few years ago, the city council ratified a resolution on the rights of the child. Rights. There are cities I know that are following the lead of Hawaii, which is the first human rights state. Kudos to you. Set the bar really high. We need to follow you all's model there. But what it means is that literally we're learning that we can apply these principles and hold our leaders accountable at every level, communities, businesses, you name it.
And that's actually a beautiful point. In the way you mention it, it's sort of like a beautiful bouquet of flowers, all those rights. And you get to just breathe that in, and you realize, I am human and I have these rights, and the government has that duty. It's a duty bearer to those rights. And we've been working a lot, and you really mentioned it as well, but COVID really did expose in many ways those economic, social, and cultural rights that we've tried to really commodify. And it's that right to healthcare, right to housing, right to education, right to water and sanitation. Do you want to build on that a bit?
Yes. I mean, when we think about, it's just so tough. When we think about COVID-19, or really any issue, right. For example, just the weather, right? Look at what happened in Texas just recently with ice taking out the whole grid. Yeah. This week, I think it's been 3 weeks since people in Jackson, Mississippi have had water. Again, because there was ice that was interesting, because it's for the length of time that it happened, and the depth of the temperatures. When we're in Chicago, they're like ice, yeah, right? 19 below wind chill, yeah. But the whole infrastructure is not prepared for that down south. And these global warming is real. The science should not be denied. And there's a direct link to the exploitation of the planet, the resources that belong to all people. So what we found is that I think the simplest thing is that when we don't respect basic human rights and ensure, a full access to basic food, water, shelter, we consider these things privileges if you can afford them, and not just you're entitled to them just because you're human and you're breathing. What that means is that a whole huge proportion of society is literally living below what most people would consider subsistence level at any given time. So as you said, with a pandemic like COVID, with these crazy wild weather pattern swings, there is just no safety net. There's no buffer. And we saw laid bare the egregious structural racism and the effects of that And, but the other side of it is that we have learned that technology can allow us to talk directly to the UN missions, to our State Department, to whomever. And to that point, we don't want that to roll back. It's still a function of the U.S. Human Rights Network as much as possible to support coalitions and delegations to go and to learn to participate in those mechanisms, teach and learn and lift this world together. But there's no reason to roll back now. They know that, even if Vickie and Josh and many other people need to be up at 2 a.m. to talk to us on Geneva time, or hey, wow, the U.S. delegations organize these side events and side sessions to inform us. It's at a respectful time for them at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m., like tomorrow morning. Right. And which makes it at the end of the day at someplace else in the world, and we can still work together to truly build a human rights culture on this globe, as opposed to a wealth-based, power-led, greedy, planet-killing, people-denying culture. We're going to change it, and we need everybody's help.
I agree. And in the UPR, it has been, like you said, 2010 was the first one, and then 2014, and now 2021. And it, if we look at this, it was definitely probably one of the worst administrations to coordinate underneath and to maneuver around. And then when it should have been reviewed in the spring, of course, COVID hit, and the government didn't even have a single line about COVID in its report that was due. And then we continued, as you mentioned. I remember November 6th at way too early in the morning. Oh, hell, what dawn that is. Speaking there, and that's the side, though, is all those recommendations. There's 347. We can almost trace all of them back to the stories shared by either the time we did the pre-session with the European Union, or when we had the side event, really 3 days after the election. And we were able to speak directly to those missions and say, this person is not recognizing the results. If you are a friend of freedom and democracy, make the difficult recommendation, because we, the people, are standing up for our rights, and we need you to be allies with directly impacted peoples. And that's why we can see, of those 347 recommendations, they are directly linked to those different interventions we gave, and all virtual. There was very low carbon, just early morning is how we did that, where I think we can continue doing that, and that'll be the way we go forward. And it's a way to supplement. It's a lot can get done in person, but it's also a way that we can make sure, now that we've figured it out, how to bring as many people as possible voice to the global arena and let the US know the whole world is watching.
Exactly. So, I'm so glad you mentioned several of those various side sessions. And then also to say, I'm aware that there's some of the same people, some of the same parties, some of the same missions, both here in our government, who are watching and listening, as well as elsewhere around the world, who may be at a session for the IACHR, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, or the urgent debate on structural racism and policing and brutality, or the Universal Periodic Review, or feedback from one of the rapporteurs or one of the special rapporteurs. So all of these have a cumulative effect. And when you are hearing the messages, in addition to the thousands of people around the world who are in the street following the murder of George Floyd, when you're hearing those messages over and over, then for me to be able to spend a couple of days, for example, helping an 84-year-old mom in Chicago, Mrs. Marielle Johnson, whose son still is incarcerated as a teenager. He was one of those who was tortured by John Burge and his henchmen. I usually don't even mention that name because it's about Chicago police torture and the law enforcement piece. One person was held accountable. Many of the rest are not. Some of the judges are still sitting judges that took false confessions, as prosecutors at that time. But the activists are still working. So Mrs. Marielle, 84 years old, worked with me to get her 2-pager together to be able to submit that written documentation. She came and gave a succinct you know, 2-minute testimony. In addition to her, another mother, Miss Bertha Escamilla, also Chicago. Thankfully, her son has been finally released, but he's scarred forever, and he cannot forget those who are left behind, who are still there. And he said, you know what, I met some people who weren't innocent, but what they did, you know, was maybe literally not selling, but smoked, you know, weed, and are still locked up for something that people are making millions of dollars legally selling now. Right. How is this right? And these mothers are committed to helping decarcerate. There also was a testimony from a very, very young Latino, they call them 3Ls, right? Third-year law student who worked with an organization, courageous organization called First Defense Legal Aid. He was testifying with regard to incommunicado detention, which still happens in Chicago and many other cities in the United States, right? It's not over just because we got this one finding. And interestingly, I want to make this point, within days, there was action on some local city pressure that they were putting on to get the city council and the governor actually at the state level to sign a moratorium on these black sites, they call them, and basically to end communicado detention. So it doesn't always require the UPR to have the final recommendation. This matters. The human rights framework and the findings and the pressure and the voices matter. And then just two more I want to mention. There literally was a just compelling testimony from two brothers, two men, black men, who had been incarcerated as teens. They got picked up, you know, profiled. And long story short, they were educated and politicized while behind bars. They're very principled, just men, pillars of society now, one young and one about my age, which is as young as you feel. But they are advocating for the US political prisoners. US has political prisoners, quiet as it's kept. And if anybody has seen the movie that recently was out with regard to the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago, those 19-year-old young former Black Panthers, you can learn the story that makes it clear that these are not criminals. These are people who were advocating, just as we are, to stop basically discriminating against people and denying and violating their human rights on the basis of their color, their race, their gender, their you know, poverty or lack thereof. So we have a long and strong history in this country of denying people's civil rights and certainly human rights. And the work that we're doing right now is to change that, because US really is better than that.
It's a really good point, and it really brings up exactly what you're sharing on those recommendations. And it's really two things. One is, and I know we have to end, but tomorrow will be the adoption of the UPR. After that, though, Resolution 43-1, focusing on police brutality and systemic racism, will be there as well before the week ends. So that's two examples of the US being under global scrutiny. But you also brought up an excellent point about the Decade of African Descent. And this year's the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. So the US does need a national action plan. And maybe we'll have to come back for another time, because just like Miles behind you, half an hour is already gone, but we have so much more that we can share. But Vickie, I want to thank you so much for appearing this week and sharing and letting people know about the adoption of the UPR that'll take place on March 17th. We ask everybody to accept my recommendation and to continue this campaign that exists for centuries. And the last point that you said was so true. It's political prisoners of conscience who are truthfully just human rights defenders according to international standards, and too many are behind bars. So we have to work and look at that historically, but then take those big leaps forward. So it's our chance to build forward in the US for a better global future, and look forward to continue strategizing for a greater solidarity among all elements of our society. Mahalo, and thank you so much, Vickie.
Thank you, mahalo.